David, we'll now hand over to you. I think you perhaps have the most challenging job, as you're not talking about just one disciplinary group, but two. So the floor is yours.
Okay, let's try and share the screen. Hopefully.
It's up, but the slideshow is a
Yeah,
voice.
okay. Let me just get back. Are we all there now?
Yes, we are.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, firstly, I should thank James and colleagues for inviting me back this month, and perhaps apologise to the participants for having to put up with me with 2 months in a row. And as James has said, this subject is incredibly wide. For those of you that don't know me, I'm essentially a retired philosopher, specialising in political philosophy and moral philosophy, but I also deliver the training on behalf of UKRIO. So if any universities request training in research ethics, it's me that you'll usually see. I chair an NHS ethics committee, and as you can see, I also, perhaps a little bit controversially, chair the Deep Mind Ethics Committee as well. Moving on. This was the abstract that I provided and that you've probably read about. And I just want to highlight a key point, and that is, does consent have any place at all in the arts, humanities and social sciences? Now, fairly obviously, I'm going for something which is, I suppose, verging on the polemical, and even asking that question is open to obvious challenges. But nevertheless, it does seem to me to be a question worth asking. So broadly, the outline of what I'm going to talk about is, firstly, I'm going to argue that consent is a predominantly legal concept. It's not really, primarily at least, anything much to do with ethics, and yet it preoccupies research ethics, ethics review, the work of ethics committees, and so on. In the background is actually a really long-standing debate about the inappropriateness of the biomedical approach to research ethics in the arts, humanities and social sciences. I'm going to argue that long-standing debate is still long-standing, and I don't actually think much progress has been made. And yet I know that social scientists in particular are looking for a different sort of paradigm. They're looking for a different approach from research ethics committees. They believe that their areas of research are substantially different to those that take place in biomedicine and the life sciences as well. So I'm going to posit perhaps a more radical overhaul, and certainly questioning the role of consent. And building up on that point that I made earlier, does it have any role? Is it conceptually incoherent? And in trying to come to some conclusions, I want to suggest some alternatives to consent, but loosely based on virtue ethics. For those of you that have heard me speak before, you probably won't be surprised about that. So, thinking about consent as a predominantly legal issue. Now, this is consent in common law. This is, I suppose, this is loosely speaking the idea that when we undertake research activities with research, I think I'm going to say subjects, then we want to make sure that we're not sued for anything that might go wrong. So essentially it's a defence. That's the way it operates. There's a bit more detail there, but this is just I just did a simple Google on consent, and this is the sources there at the bottom. In criminal law, consent has an even, I think, stronger role. Fortunately, I've never been in the position where a police officer or court asks me something and my response is, oh, but she consented. However, it clearly highlights the role of consent as far as crime is concerned. And rape and assault and battery are obvious examples. But there are some areas of research which would be criminally an assault or a battery if it were not for consent. So we're building up this idea of consent as essentially a legal matter. So it's a legal defence for what would otherwise be a harm. And I think it's really important to hang on to this idea of defences against harms. Now, in biomedical research, I don't think there is any doubt about the need for formal documented consent processes. I don't disagree with basically what Margaret has put forward. In medical research, we see things like giving of noxious substances. You know, think about drug trials and things like that. Things can easily go wrong. It's very useful to say, but the participant consented. There are various other intrusions on bodily integrity. And again, it's very useful to be able to declare and have some evidence that the person, the participant, actually consented. If one also looks at the relationships between researchers and participants, there are really considerable ethical issues. Normal relationships and expectations change. And in fact, in some cases, you would say that what the researcher goes on to do would otherwise be indefensible in the absence of consent. So the whole relationship changes. For example, a doctor whose duty would normally be to provide the best evidence-based medical care and treatment changes role and becomes a researcher. Now, that is something that the patient needs to be aware of, and the patient becomes a subject rather than a patient. Now, in those sorts of circumstances, I think that it's entirely appropriate that RECs should be concerned with the validity of consent and the risks of harm. It makes perfect sense. On the other hand, harms in research in the arts and humanities and social sciences, they are pretty rare. They're mostly none. And mostly they're no more than those that are encountered in everyday life. So we're immediately raising the issue as to whether or not consent is required to defend a harm. Harms are, if at all, are typically secondary. So things like data mismanagement or something could be a harm from participating in these areas of research, but that is not a harm which is directly related to participation. So generally speaking, relationships tend to be as expected. There are little or no anticipated harms which actually are in need of defence. Now that seems to me to make a huge distinction between these two broad areas of research. However, having made that point, what do RECs actually do? Well, they still seem to be concerned with the validity of consent and the risks of harms. So RECs that are reviewing research in the arts, humanities and social sciences still tend to focus their interests on consent and actually more likely consent forms, participant information sheets, and all the other paraphernalia of documents that seem to have much more of a place in biomedical research. So broadly, I'm going to go on and argue that actually we need a paradigm shift in the roles of ethics committees when they're reviewing research from the arts, humanities and social sciences. So the debate, it's, as I said earlier, this is a very long-running debate where particularly social scientists have been protesting for a long, long time. Why should we be drawn into a biomedical research paradigm, particularly when it comes to ethics? That top link, developing generic ethics principles, is clickable, and this refers to a project which was launched by the Academy of Social Sciences nearly 10 years ago, or around about 10 years ago. And I commend colleagues, some of them might be here today, John Oates, who spoke in the last webinar, and his colleagues Robert Dingwall, Ron Ifofen, and Janet Lewis. It was a very good project. That next link is, if you want to hear Ron speaking on this, he speaks very eloquently indeed. So what is the beef, to put it crudely? Well, regulation of RECs seems to be modelled on healthcare research, which makes it almost the wrong regulatory framework. And these researchers typically criticise this preemptive approach to review. So, so ethics review is all about pretty well a hurdle to be encountered before the researcher can get out there and learn anything. And actually, if you look at a lot of research in the social sciences, there's a lot of groundwork to do, often or not, before ethics review is necessary. And also, of course, a lot of the research is exploratory, it's iterative. It doesn't lend itself to, here is this fixed protocol and here are these documents. It needs to be approached rather differently. These critics have also criticised the focus on harm or the risk of it. And they see that it goes as far as almost acting as a proxy for ethics. So ethics review conducted by an ethics committee will all too often be a focus on harm, and in many cases, harm is just not in prospect. So academic freedoms are limited, bureaucratic hurdles are erected, which become highly obstructive, and most fundamentally, the process seems to be more about the protection of institutions than actually furthering ethics. Now, in a biomedical sense, that probably makes perfect sense. We want to protect the institutions. We don't want universities sued or researchers sued and so on, because harms might well be in prospect. Now, out of that project, the Academy of Social Sciences project, 5 principles emerged, and these are still in common use. They're reflected in ESRC guidance and various other sources of guidance. The idea was to find 5 principles which could be considered as common across research in the social sciences. And there's no reason why the humanities and art should not be added to that. Now, I was privileged in that project. I gave the first paper in the first symposium, in which I broadly objected to principlism. Now, that top link will take you to all of those papers and so on. Now, my moan is that I don't think this goes far enough. It does not distinguish social science as a specific discipline, let alone rolling in humanities and the arts. And the reason why I would suggest that is that you could take these 5 principles and simply do this to them, because biomedical fits just as well as social science. So, you know, really, we're not getting to the heart of the paradigm shift that's needed to accommodate social science, arts, and humanities. So, what about a new model? And here I will be as bold as to suggest, let's start with removing the emphasis on consent. I mean, one of the interesting things in social sciences is often or not, it can be the very issue of consent that puts participants at risk. You imagine, I don't know, a study involving an investigation of the lives of women who are prone to violence from their partners. Do you really want to send them home with a copy of the consent form and information sheet? It seems to me pretty silly. There are other examples as well where it will be entirely appropriate to completely obscure the identity of the participant, but unfortunately their identity is boldly revealed at the bottom of a consent form. So back to my point, do we have to have this emphasis on consent in these wider areas of research? Now, don't get me wrong, I think some areas of social research do involve harms. Some include experiments, some include deceit, and in those sorts of circumstances it might be entirely appropriate to stick with the biomedical model and that biomedical paradigm. I really, I don't think there's any difficulty with that at all. On the other hand, you could actually also reverse this and say there are some areas of biomedical research where there are no harms, there's no particular experiments, there's no deceit. Do you really need formal consent to conduct those? So I think it does cut both ways. But there are many examples where consent, in my view at least, is neither necessary nor appropriate. I don't think it's rocket science to say we could just ask people, do we need to go through formal processes, sign forms, long information sheets and so on, when it would be far more appropriate to just ask? And just asking seems to me to be an obvious alternative to formal consent. Particularly, again, I come back and say, where there are no harms in prospect. And in fact, referring back to Inka's talk, she showed a typical checklist used in universities to try and identify whether a study requires ethics review. It might be quite valuable to add to that checklist, particularly for the benefit of social scientists, whether there are any harms which are in prospect. Because if there aren't, then maybe there's no need to look at things or ask for things like consent forms and participant information sheets. And certainly not to keep pushing the typical university templates that it seems that all researchers seem to be obliged to follow, whether they're in the biomedical sciences or indeed whether they're social scientists or artists. Why do recs require slavish adherence to the typical university template? Going back to my point about relationships, and surely this is what it's really about as far as the arts and humanities is concerned, these relationships should not be legalistic. They should not be contractual. There are alternatives in the social sciences. Those relationships, I would suggest, should be sharing, open relationships. We should have true participants, or I would go further and say co-producers and co-researchers, rather than people who are seen in a subject role. Participants should equally be collaborators, and this relationship should be built on mutual respect, and it should be non-hierarchical. I mean, some academics will go as far as suggesting that friendships can be entirely appropriate in the field of social research. Anne Oakley is probably the best example. I'll leave it to you to go Googling and see what Anne Oakley did in terms of developing long-term relationships with the women that she actually interviewed in various studies. So just a few examples to bring some of this to the fore and make it a bit more practical. Most qualitative research probably doesn't require formal consent. Most qualitative research is going to be exploratory, iterative, respectful, one would hope, and there will be many examples where there's absolutely no prospect of any harm to any individual. I include some of the things that are almost contrived as harm, the risk of causing distress and so on. I'll come back to that in a minute. An ethnography, much used method amongst social scientists and and those working in humanities. You know, the idea of an ethnography is to give various groups within a broader community a voice. No one wants to go in there and change anything. It's all about giving voices. It's really highly democratic. You know, why would you need to consent in those sorts of circumstances? Participatory action research is probably the best example of where consent is not only necessary, if it's conducted appropriately, it should disappear, because the lines between researcher and participant should be so blurred that if there's any consent at all, both sides should be submitting consent forms to the other. Some sort of consensus understanding is needed rather than involving people in that sort of way. Now, experimental art, you know, trying to look at some methods in the performing arts. Experimental art, a lot of it is there to shock, and that often raises concerns in ethics committees. We really need to get people's consent if they're going to be shocked. Well, I've been to plenty of art galleries and seen plenty of shocking art. Nobody actually collects my consent along the way. The most they would do for some exhibitions would put a little health warning outside. I don't have to sign a consent form, and why would I? And in areas like immersive drama, again, I would know that if I was participating in something like that, that it would probably be a cathartic experience. I don't need to sign a specific consent form. It's just a reasonable expectation of the activity. This is all a bit like, I mean, I have a terrible habit of watching medical documentaries on the TV, the ones that really are crudely a bit iffy. Now, often or not, there is this sort of warning at the beginning which says, you know, you might see some nasty injuries or some sort of nasty operation and so on. I'm never asked to sign a consent form. I decide for myself at that point whether I want to go on and watch that programme or whether I'd rather turn over and watch something else. So, if I try and pull this together, and this is very much a work in progress, for many areas in the arts, social sciences and humanities, we need a different approach to ethics. And I mean a truly different approach. Coming up with a set of principles isn't good enough. We need to challenge things like the role of consent. So instead of having consent, maybe the ethics committee should look for things like polite requests and invitations, not a reproduced consent form template. Maybe ethics committees should be looking for true respect being shown to research participants. And, you know, that's quite difficult to translate that from an information sheet. One thing that I think is incredibly important, particularly when there are elements of co-researching and co-production, is absolute transparency, so that the research participants are just as aware of the research objectives as the researchers. Now, obviously that's not going to work in all cases, and there are plenty of alternatives where consent, particularly if there's a need to hide the research objectives in some way, consent might well still be necessary. One would expect elements of solidarity and mutuality, good old-fashioned virtues. So again, the Research Ethics Committee should be looking for evidence of that. You know, to what extent are the researchers trying to engage the participants in some sort of mutual venture that all are signed up to? There should obviously be trust, and most significantly, I think, a lack of hierarchies, because the best of social research actually at least attempts to demolish the hierarchies that get in the way of relationships, important relationships, between researchers and participants. So I think I'll stop there if that's okay, and happy to take any questions.
David, thank you very much. We already had a lot of questions come in. Okay, so it's about 3:40. We've got about 15 minutes of questions, and then what we may do is bring back all the panelists for the last few minutes to address some issues, I think, across all three presentations. So thank you for that fascinating talk. You ended with talking about ideally having a lack of hierarchies, and it was asked if you is it realistic to talk about non-hierarchical relationships between a heavily funded institution and a private individual when the point at issue is perhaps, say, personal information about that individual? There's an inherent sort of hierarchy and power imbalance there, and I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
But I mean, obviously, following my arguments, the ethical researcher will be doing their very best to minimise that hierarchy, if not actually remove it altogether. I would suggest that part of ethical research in the social sciences is to do something about the hierarchical relationship. It's entirely different in biomedicine. It makes sense to have a bit of a distance, perhaps a considerable distance, between a researcher and a research subject. Otherwise, the data could be incredibly contaminated. In the social sciences, you actually want to get rid of hierarchies so that you get genuine sharing of data. The last thing you want is a participant who feels somehow or other subservient, because you're not going to get data of any value if you do that.
Thank you. The point has been raised by one attendee that the ethical principle of voluntary informed consent is about ensuring participants agree to take part and they have a choice. And they would say that whether this is called consent, agreement, or acceptance, it kind of remains the same thing. So they're suggesting that what you're discussing regarding the social science research is more the method of consent, agreement, and rather than the content or requirements of consent.
I'm afraid the question has shot themselves in the foot by saying it's about agreement. Now, agreement is very different to consent, as I showed right at the beginning of the talk. Consent is essentially legal. It's about defences. Agreement is about an understanding between two people, which I would suggest is not furthered by a formal information sheet and consent form.
Thank you. It's been raised as that you're talking about a lack of harm. There isn't much harm most commonly in certain types of research, and a number of people have raised issues that what about the potential for psychological distress as a form of harm, harm being considered in relation to words, images, ideas that can make people reflect on traumatic and difficult experiences. And so wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I mean, it is a fairly standard position to say that some research, and probably psychological research is a good example here, where there may be the potential for distress and so on. But it also has to be noted that this sort of stressing about those sorts of harms is often really quite paternalistic. And particularly, I know there have been earlier questions about this, particularly with people with mental health problems and so on, where the fact that they've got a mental health problem seems to put them into some sort of box which makes them vulnerable and having to be treated in a specific way. Well, you know, I would suggest that's stigmatizing and actually quite discriminatory. So we need to avoid what is essentially paternalism. But of course, I agree that people need to know what the research is about, and if it involves, I suppose, discussing issues which to them could be distressing for any reason, then they shouldn't agree to participate. But I don't think signing a consent form gets the researcher off the hook for distressing people.
Thank you. a number of people said that GDPR has, in their view, increased insistence on the sort of things such as standard consent templates and the like, and they're wondering, firstly, is there a danger of perhaps participants being, or potential participants being bombarded with an awful lot of extra documentation, but how do you balance that requirement to give people the legally mandated information and collect the legally mandated information, while also ensuring that people are able to get, understand the information cogently, while avoiding burdening them with excessive paperwork?
I think we need to be quite clear that, particularly in a university setting and in a health trust setting, GDPR has got little to do with consent. GDPR it essentially prescribes the legal basis for the processing of data as being in the public interest. The legal basis is specifically not consent, because the danger is that if the legal basis is consent, of course, people can rightly withdraw their consent, whereas universities have actually been liberated by GDPR, and I'm sure all people participating in this webinar, if you go back to your universities and ask your information officer about the legal basis of GDPR, it's actually public interest, it's not consent. Now, that requires transparency statements, which need not and don't have to be any part of any consent process. Transparency statements are issued by universities so that anybody who shares their personal data, and that needs to be very clearly distinguished from research data, so personal data, anything that will identify them, any person, research participant, student, any other member of the university community needs to know how those data are processed. That's not really got anything to do with consent at all. So I would suggest if there is any blurring, then that needs sorting out. Transparency statements need to be provided to any person who actually shares personal data with any institution. And that's standard practice. But actually, GDPR, if anything, has made the researcher's life a lot easier.
Yeah, a number of people have reflected that a requirement under GDPR is to retain evidence of consent, particularly consent, and you need to be able to evidence the consent to process personal data.
Sorry, just going to disagree with that. That GDPR doesn't require evidence of consent. It requires that people are properly informed about processing of their data. The difficulty is that this whole area of consent has got really very, very confused. I mean, essentially, in research context, consent is relating to common law duties in relation to the management of information. So you might still require consent if, for example, you're going to access somebody's medical record. That would be a classic example. But it's not a GDPR requirement. It is a common law requirement that you should not be accessing confidential information without a person's consent. That's where consent comes into play. But it's not really to do with the broad aspects of GDPR.
Sorry, I just realised I was muted. A couple of questions are coming asking for some practical guidance. Philip asked, how would you manage the ethics of research that falls under the prevent duty? For example, seeking consent, say, if you're in a chat room researching radicalisation. And can you either recommend any good sources of practical advice on that issue?
I suppose the short answer is probably no. It's a difficult area for research generally, where there are clearly public legal duties, which I suppose bear more strongly on researchers working in university institutions as well. So it's not just issues under the prevent duty, it would also be safeguarding and so on. And here again, I'm not sure that it has to be a matter of consent, but I think that anybody, take the safeguarding one, and generally speaking, prevent also relates to younger people. I know it's got wider application, but that would surely be part of that trusting relationship between researcher and participant. That you would have to make it clear that should there be any concerns about the safety of either that participant or other people, then you would have to disclose information. I'm not sure that much is added to that by recording it in writing. It just makes, well, first, it's a legal duty for a start, but secondly, it's the sort of thing that you can use to build up a relationship with the participant.
Thank you. Okay, a couple of questions. How do we develop objectivity and empathy necessary in students and PIs for participants, whether pursuing formal consent models or potential alternatives? There's noted that ethnography and the arts can have complex histories of basically people deciding, people with power and agency deciding what is right or wrong in terms of how you treat people who lack power and agency. And equally, there can be challenges, I know, for example, my own discipline of archaeology, of people treating those from less advantageous backgrounds as effectively fuel for research projects. So how do you consider we make sure we don't abuse positions of privileges in such situations?
Well, I mean, my first answer is that's why we have research ethics committees, to make sure just that sort of thing does not occur. I mean, in good ethnography, I mean, I accept there are examples in the past where the particular groups concerned, I suppose their welfare and consideration has been very much marginalised to the interest of the researcher. But that's what we have ethics committees for, to make sure just that sort of thing doesn't happen. I mean, if you're looking, some of the ethnographic studies that I provided ethics support for in the past, they directly address issues such as how the researcher introduces themselves to the community, how they make their role clear, how they give a voice to members of the community, how they often or not develop at least co-researchers within the community, so that it isn't something imposed externally on groups of people. Now, I mean, it would seem to me obvious that we're looking for ethical ethnography, any signs of anything which looks exploitative, and frankly, sometimes the use of things like information sheets and consent forms, they build that hierarchy. They actually say, you sign away here, not you join me in this really interesting journey from which we hope to learn something. So I still come back and say, well, it's the role of the ethics committee to get this right. But if ethics committees are constantly focusing on information sheets and consent forms, they're going to miss what really matters,